The first thing everyone noticed about him was the suit. It didn't fit. The jacket sleeves stopped just shy of his wrists, exposing cuffs that had been ironed so carefully they looked pressed with hope. The shoes were polished but cracked at the seams. And when he stepped into the marble lobby of Ashford Capital's headquarters, heads turned not in admiration but in quiet confusion. Daniel Ruiz noticed. He noticed everything. The way conversations dipped half a tone when he passed. The receptionist's smile that felt professionally thin. The security guard who glanced twice at his visitor badge. He almost turned around. He should have been at his second job by now, stacking shelves at a grocery store on the edge of town. Instead, he stood under a chandelier worth more than his yearly income, clutching a worn leather folder that held spreadsheets he'd built. After midnight, while his 7-year-old daughter slept beside him on the couch. He wasn't supposed to be here, but someone had forwarded his email. And now, somehow, he had a meeting on the 42nd floor with the CEO. Ethan Caldwell didn't believe in luck. He believed in leverage, timing, and power. At 39, he was the kind of billionaire who made headlines for buying companies before breakfast and firing executives before lunch. Ashford Capital wasn't just successful, it was ruthless. And Ethan liked it that way. So when his assistant mentioned that some retail investor had sent an unsolicited portfolio analysis of Ashford's recent acquisition, Ethan had laughed. Forward it to the team, he'd said. Or better yet, invite him in. Let's have some fun. It had been a long week. Markets were volatile. Reporters were circling. His board was restless. He could use the entertainment. Daniel sat in a glass conference room that felt like an aquarium. Outside, men and women in tailored suits moved with purpose, glancing in as though he were an exhibit. Across the table sat 3 senior analysts and a vice president, whose watch probably cost more than Daniel's car. At the head of the table, Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, expression sharp and amused. So, Ethan said, tapping Daniel's folder with a manicured finger, you're the one who thinks we overpaid by 11.6%. Daniel swallowed. I don't think, he said quietly. I ran the numbers. A few people smirked. Ethan's smile widened. Is that right? Daniel nodded. His hands trembled slightly, so he folded them together. Your acquisition of Meridian Biotech assumes revenue growth based on optimistic FDA approval timelines. But if you adjust for historical delays, especially in that sector, you'll see the projected cash flow shifts significantly. One of the analysts scoffed. You're using public data. Yes, Daniel said. Public data most firms overlook when they're moving fast. The room stilled just slightly. Ethan leaned forward now, interest flickering behind his eyes. And what would you have done differently? Daniel hesitated. Not because he didn't know, but because he wasn't sure how far he was allowed to go. Restructured the deal, he said finally. Tie a portion of the payment to milestone-based approvals. Reduce upfront exposure. And hedge against the first 18 months of volatility. Silence. Not mocking this time. Calculating. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. One of the analysts cleared his throat. That's actually a standard protective structure, which we didn't implement, another murmured. Ethan shot them both a look. Then he turned back to Daniel. You work in finance? He asked. Daniel shook his head. Auto repair. The vice president blinked. I'm sorry? I manage a small shop, Daniel clarified. Mostly transmissions and brakes. And in your spare time, Ethan said slowly, you audit billion-dollar acquisitions. Daniel's ears burned. I study markets at night. Why? The question hung heavier than expected. Daniel looked down at his hands. Because I promised my daughter I'd build something better for her. No one laughed. Ethan studied him differently now. What's her name? He asked. Lucia. Ethan nodded once. Then, almost casually, he said, All right, Mr. Ruiz. Let's test you. He pulled up a live market dashboard on the wall screen. If you're so confident, Ethan continued, tone cool again. Give us your advice. Right now, we're considering a significant move in renewable infrastructure. Convince me. It was meant to corner him, to watch him stumble. Daniel felt it. He also felt something else, the memory of Lucia asleep on his chest. Her small hand curled into his shirt, the way she'd whispered, You're the smartest dad ever, after he helped her with math homework. He stood, walked to the screen, and began. He didn't use buzzwords, didn't posture. He talked about long-term grid modernization, about overlooked regional players, about tax credit cycles and community-level adoption trends. He spoke like a man who had nothing to lose and everything to protect. He spoke for 20 minutes. No one interrupted. When he finished, the room was quiet in a different way now, charged. Ethan's expression had changed. The amusement was gone. In its place was something colder. Recognition, because Daniel wasn't just right. He was early. 3 months later, the renewable infrastructure play became Ashford's most profitable move of the year, structured almost exactly the way Daniel had outlined. The financial press called it visionary. Ethan called it inconvenient. Because he hadn't been the visionary. Daniel didn't hear from them again after that meeting. He assumed he'd been a passing curiosity, a story executives would laugh about over drinks. Life returned to normal. Morning school drop-offs, grease-stained hands, late-night spreadsheets, until the letter arrived. It wasn't flashy. No gold seal. Just a simple envelope with Ashford Capital's logo. Inside was a check and a note. Consulting fee for services rendered. The amount made his knees buckle. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was breathing room. Lucia needed braces. The shop's lift had been malfunctioning for months. Rent had crept up again. He stared at the signature at the bottom. Ethan Caldwell. No joke. No condescension. Just acknowledgement. 6 months after that, the markets turned. Hard. A geopolitical crisis sent energy prices spiraling. Regulatory shifts hit biotech valuations. Ashford Capital took a visible hit. The board panicked. And for the first time in his career, Ethan Caldwell hesitated. He found himself thinking about a man in an ill-fitting suit who had seen risk where others saw momentum. So he did something he'd never done before. He reached out. Daniel almost ignored the call. Unknown number. But something made him answer. Mr. Ruiz, came the familiar voice. I'd like to offer you a position. Daniel laughed softly. I run a repair shop. I'm aware. Why me? A pause. Because you don't chase noise, Ethan said. You look at fundamentals. You think long-term. Daniel glanced at Lucia, coloring at the kitchen table. What kind of position? Strategic risk consultant? Flexible hours. Daniel was quiet. You'd be paid accordingly, Ethan added. It wasn't about the money. Not entirely. It was about stepping into a world that had laughed at him. A world that had tried to make him a joke. I have one condition, Daniel said finally. Ethan wasn't used to conditions. Name it. I keep the shop. I don't move Lucia out of her school. And I work remote unless absolutely necessary. Ethan exhaled slowly. Done. The headlines, months later, didn't mention the auto mechanic. They praised Ashford Capital's unexpected resilience during turbulent times. They credited bold restructuring strategies and disciplined risk management. But inside the firm, people knew. They knew who had flagged overexposure in foreign bonds, who had urged patience instead of panic selling, who had suggested reallocating funds into community-backed, renewable co-ops before federal subsidies expanded. Daniel never asked for recognition. He still wore modest suits to the rare in-person meetings, still left early for school recitals, still packed Lucia's lunches every morning. And one evening, after a long board meeting that had nearly derailed into chaos, Ethan found him alone in the conference room, staring out at the city lights. You know, Ethan said quietly, I invited you in that first day as a joke. Daniel smiled faintly. I figured. I thought I'd embarrass you. You almost did. Ethan looked at him. Really looked at him. I've built this entire empire believing power meant control, he said. But you operate differently. Daniel shrugged. When you don't have power, you learn to value people instead. Ethan swallowed. For the first time in years, he felt small, not diminished, grounded. What do you want, Daniel? He asked. Long term. Daniel didn't hesitate. A scholarship fund, he said. For kids like Lucia. For single parents who can't afford elite internships or Ivy League networks. Smart people get overlooked every day. Ethan nodded slowly. Then let's build it. The Caldwell-Ruiz initiative launched the following year. It didn't make splashy headlines, but it sent dozens of first-generation students into finance. engineering and entrepreneurship programs across the country. Daniel still fixed transmissions on Saturdays, still read market reports after midnight, but now sometimes he stood in auditoriums filled with students who looked like him, nervous, hopeful, underestimated, and he told them the truth. They might laugh, he'd say gently. Let them. Do the math anyway, because the real power wasn't in being the loudest voice in the room. It was in being the one who saw clearly when others didn't. And somewhere, high above the city in a glass tower, a billionaire CEO who once looked for entertainment had learned something far more valuable. That genius doesn't care about suits, that wisdom doesn't check bank accounts, and that sometimes the strongest investments aren't in markets, they're in people.